Welcome to this podcast is making me thirsty, the number one destination for Seinfeld fans. This episode 161. Today's guest is a New York Times bestselling author, a critic, podcast host. He's an Emmy-nominated writer who's contributed to Rolling Stone magazine. He's written and produced for the Grammy Awards for over 2 decades. He hosts a popular podcast, Naked Lunch, with Everyone Loves Raymond creator Phil Rosenthal. And of course, he has authored 7 books, including Seinfeld, the totally unauthored tribute. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Please welcome David Wild. David, thanks for joining.
Well, I'm very excited to hear about myself now that we've introduced me. I sound good.
And more importantly, David is a Tenafly, New Jersey native, so we got to get that out there. So 25 years ago, 1998, David, the book Totally Unauthorized Tribute came out. Obviously, that was Seinfeld's final year. Take us back. Tell us a little bit how the book came about. Obviously, you were a fan, but this was obviously the biggest show in America at that time. What made you write the book?
It's well, the short answer is because someone asked, and that's always a good reason for me. It's like also someone with a check in hand asked. But what had happened was I was thinking back about this when you guys asked me. I'm honored to be on, but it's funny. I had this weird zone around that time of I was asked to be a Jan Wenner, who ran Rolling Stone, who sold Rolling Stone, but started it. At a certain point, maybe he got tired of my writing about rock musicians, and he said, I want you to write a TV column. And it was actually kind of a smart move because I love music so much that I was sometimes too respectful of everything. But with TV, I sort of found I was never as respectful. I loved what I loved, but I also wasn't afraid to make fun of things. So I ended up being like the TV critic for like 4 years at Rolling Stone. And during that time, I also wrote a lot of cover stories. And I wrote a early cover story, first season of Friends. And the Friends cast could only agree on me to write a book when Warner Brothers insisted there be a book as the show was taking off at the end of that first year. So I wrote the official Friends book, which became a huge bestseller, not because of me, but because of the adorable Friends. I felt like I was the seventh ugly friend or something like that. The only unappealing person involved with the show. And because that book did so well and became a big bestseller, other publishers asked me to do TV books, and I got a call saying, would you do a Seinfeld book? And I loved Seinfeld. I probably loved Seinfeld, Raymond, Friends. Those were the 3 great popular comedies of that sort of era. But when they asked me to do a Seinfeld book, I said, absolutely. But then, and I sort of but it wasn't unlike with Friends. It wasn't the show asking me to do it. So I sort of did it as an unofficial tribute to the book, but in the same loving spirit. But then Seinfeld announced he was ending the show, like within a month or 2 of me signing to do a book. So, which is good timing in a way. I have one unbelievably weird memory, which is the book deal was completed with a publisher who I should check who it was. It was a division of, I think it was Random House, Three Rivers Press. And they called me afterwards and said, a week after we signed the book deal with you, or a week after Jerry announced the show was ending, Carl Bernstein called them, pitching a book on Seinfeld. Woodward and Bernstein, Carl Bernstein. And they said, well, I'm sorry, Carl, but we already made a deal with David Wild. To which they said, he went, damn it, David Wild beat me to the scoop. Beat me to the story. And I'm like, well, yeah, you got Watergate. I got this book. So it's sort of, I think you got the bigger scoop.
Wow. So I just assumed the book came out because it was the final season, right?
No.
But no.
It was just sort of in the wake of the Friends book doing so well, someone said, you write, they like the way I write about TV, and you'd make it a fun book as opposed to, it wasn't a scholarly tome I have not looked at this book in many years. So I can't, I apologize if you had to, and if I have no idea what's in it, but I do remember it was done quickly, but out of love. That was the truth. I did love the show.
Yeah, I got it back then in '98. I actually used it. Speaking of scholarly, I bring this up sometimes in my master's degree. I wrote my thesis on Seinfeld, and I cited your book a few times, so I still have it. It's a great, no offense, but it's tied to Seinfeld. It's a great bathroom book as well, kind of just to skim through. I used to have it down in my bathroom.
I'm proud to be
flagged.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, you touched on this. Obviously, you're a fan of the show. When did it click for you? Did it hit you like watching Seinfeld? Because we always talk about watching it live and how it was unlike anything else that was on TV at the time. And right around season 2, some of those episodes that came out, you're just like, wow, this is completely different than anything else we've seen. Was there sort of an episode that you remember, or maybe a line, or even a season where you were like, kind of like, this is it, I'm hooked on this thing, it's different than anything I've seen before, that kind of like, that was kind of like the moment where you kind of, jumped in?
Well, it's funny. I actually think I watched from the very beginning because I was in New York. Let's see, I graduated. I went to Cornell graduated '84, went to work at Esquire and then Rolling Stone in New York for a couple of years. During that time, so it's somewhere '80s, I'm not sure when, I used to go to the comic strip, the comic strip. And I think Seinfeld must have been an absolute regular there. So he was my favorite. I just loved him as a comedian. So I was one of the people who, I think, even when it started under its sort of low-key way through the late night team or whatever, I think I was watching from the beginning and then saw it become the force that it became. But it's interesting. If we were to go, I will not. I'm praying you don't try to quiz me on Seinfeld, because the truth is I have a weird relationship to all the sitcoms that I love. Like, I don't know if either of you have kids. I have kids who like shows like Seinfeld, including Seinfeld. They're people who watch shows over and over again.
Right.
I don't think and in fact, with Phil Rosenthal, we on our podcast last week, someone asked a question like, what was his favorite episode of Everybody Loves Raymond, and asked me what my favorite band was. But he goes, David, what's your favorite episode of Everybody Loves Raymond? And I sort of froze because I have not gone back. I mean, you can't, if you travel and you're in a hotel room, you'll see syndication of things,
right?
And then you turn the channel, because I'm just, my own viewing style is I don't like to rewatch things a million times. I would rather stream a new show. So Seinfeld it sort of taught me everything about what I loved in a sitcom. But I don't know that I could tell you my favorite episode, but I think I was watching from the beginning, and I think I pretty much never missed an episode. I absolutely, the moment that the sea was angry that day, my friend, I think yeah. that sort of is something that my wife and I will say back and forth for years to one another. The marine biologist. Is that what it's called? Is it called The Marine Biologist?
Yeah.
That is maybe one of my favorite half an hours of life ever, is that episode. But truthfully, whether it's Raymond, like on the podcast Naked Lunch that I do with Phil, I told him my wrong favorite episode. I think I have to correct it. I'll call and tell him that was not my favorite Raymond episode. I just don't have. I'm not someone who loves to go back and watch sitcoms again. But the memory of Seinfeld, I played. It's like, at Rolling Stone, we put them on the cover like they were the Beatles, like they were such. Right. And we did that with Friends too. But it's like, to me, it's like, it's different with music. I'll go back and play every album I like a million times, but sitcoms almost have a certain time. And with Seinfeld, and I'll shut up in a minute, I promise. But with Seinfeld, I have a particularly weird relationship with it. And I'm sure other people have this, because Curb Your Enthusiasm, the related show that is more recent, I think because I love Curb so much and actually have friends involved with that show, I guess if I ever during the pandemic went back and streamed something, it would be Curb. Because in a weird way, and I don't know how you feel about it as fans, Curb it's not the same kind of show at all, but in a certain way, maybe because it's slightly less scripted and more improvisational, I don't mind watching it again and again more. That one I probably have watched more than any of the traditional sitcoms.
Yeah, To your point, you brought up music. I think we talked off air about Gandolfini, like shows like The Sopranos, Seinfeld, Curb. I can put that on anytime, any order, and I'll watch it. I think that's kind of a common thread. And you mentioned like iconic shows like Friends, Raymond, even Cheers. Even me, I can't pull out a memorable episode from there. But like off the cuff, you went Marine Biologist. You probably have Keith Hernandez in your head. Like there's just Seinfeld is just different, right? Even versus Curb. Like Curb, I could watch, but I can't think of a memorable season or a memorable episode. I guess, that you and your wife are like, right? Like, wow, we just watched history here. I think that's what separated Seinfeld from the rest, if you will.
Yeah. It's funny. The pandemic maybe also was the only time I've gone back and with my family, with one of my kids or with my wife, gone back through shows. I don't know if I'll ever do that. I just have a love of new stuff all the time, and there is so much new stuff. But I will say, I don't think I could love Seinfeld more. And I have such a weird, because it was not the official book. I also was not like, it's almost like at Rolling Stone, there were like official writers for certain shows. I was the official Friends writer. Yet I was very close friends and am close friends for 25 years. Phil Rosenthal and I have had lunch every week for 25 years now.
Wow.
and do a podcast of it now. But I did not write the Raymond. I wrote one or two little Raymond stories. I never wrote the Seinfeld stories in Rolling Stone. That I think was always Bill Zamey.
It's interesting. I was looking up to see if you did, and I couldn't find any. I was doing some research before the call, and I was like, he wrote the book, but not a lot for the magazine, like you said. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was almost like and that's kind of the true if you look at Rolling Stone history, bands, like I'm from Jersey, but I was not the official Bruce Springsteen writer. I was more like the Eagles guy or the Ringo's guy or certain other, bands. It just is. It's weird the way that now. Yet Seinfeld and the people who did Seinfeld figure in my life constantly in different ways, including today. I don't know when you'll run this, but whenever you run this, the podcast that we're running a special episode tomorrow. And so what we're doing is before we started the podcast, we, as a test 3-4 years ago, whenever it was, recorded a lunch with Carl Reiner, who Phil and I, a hero of both of ours, who we had lunch with, like Phil had lunch with him probably 100 times, but I had lunch with him like 25 times. But one time we had the vision to record it. But the one we recorded was with George Shapiro, who, if you know Seinfeld history, who was one of the most amazing guys I ever knew, a really inspiring guy who I can tell you I can't tell you episodes of every show. I can tell you a lunch. It's actually, I think, the lunch that we are releasing on Naked Lunch podcast tomorrow. But it was one where after the lunch, George Shapiro, who was this incredibly warm, wonderful guy, said to me, I'm going to New York tonight on a red eye. I was like, wow. And he was younger. He was the nephew of Carl, but he was still not a young guy. And I go, wow, is that a hassle for you? Because I, for work, have traveled a lot, and you can complain about, Jews can complain about anything, as we know from Seinfeld. But he goes, no, why would I? I'm so happy. They give me a drink, they give me food, they talk nicely to me. I'm on a lovely chair. I'm like, wow, I remember thinking, I will never be someone complaining about traveling for work or anything, because if this guy in his 80s can be so happy, who am I? And I will say, yeah, Carl Reiner was the same way, like these inspiring guys who've been around forever.
Yeah. That's a great story.
And the Ryan, obviously, I think Rob had his hand in Seinfeld with Castle Rock and everything else. So there's a deep connection there. But yeah, what can you say? George, what a life. We obviously lost him over the last year, but everyone we've talked to that he touched he was such a sweetheart. So it's good to hear that he had the same effect on you.
I remember maybe right before the pandemic, I was in Vegas doing some award show or charity show, and he goes, "Oh, I'm going to be in Vegas and Jerry. You want to go? Jerry's going to rent a movie theater." He was like doing a private screening of some baseball movie, and I'm a baseball fan. You want to come and hang out with Jerry? And I'm like, there is nothing I would rather do than sit and watch a baseball movie with you and Jerry Seinfeld in Vegas in a private theater. I was there to work and I couldn't, but I will always regret that.
Damn. Yeah, I mean that's what Seinfeld is, right? I mean, I know you said you wrote the book, almost 25 years ago now, but there is a line in it that I do like, and I think it sums up the show perfectly. We talk about it all the time. You said it's basically about the way people extend adolescence well into the march of middle age, and that's really what the show is, right? We were watching it when we were 14 years old, laughing our asses off, and we're watching it now in our 40s. Laughing at the same things, right? It's basically these two guys not growing up, talking about sports, trying to figure out things about girls, right? Never know what to do. And it's just like, it just hits a chord with everyone, right? That's kind of what the show is. And to your point, it's basically sports, it's sports and girls. And that's kind of what it was when you're 15 and it's that way, in your 40s.
You just reminded me of one of my favorite episodes, which is the girlfriend switch, the roomie girlfriend switch is, I think that's one of the, I guess a lot of what I love is a lot of Jason Alexander when I think about it. I worked with him just again, like the weird ways in which I've gotten to work with people. I did work with Jason is very good friends with Brad Paisley, who's one of my close friends. And George, I think I wrote the People Choice Awards when he hosted that with Malcolm Jamal Warner. I have no other memory.
That's from their show they did, right? What was the name of that show? Not Hardball. What was it?
Listen Up.
Listen Up. That's it. Listen Up. They did that show together. Might have been
for Listen Up. It's like weird moments where I got to ask my Seinfeld questions and show the love for the show.
Yeah, and it's funny the show. You mentioned a lot of obviously music, your love for music, and I always like to make a comparison, like someone like Dylan, right? If you look at someone like Dylan, if you show someone Freewheelin' and then you show them like Shot of Love, and then you show them like John Wesley Harding, and then you show them like a Rolling Stone. Right? There's all these different genres and eras that he's kind of crossed, right? And you can't just say I like him or I don't like him, right? There may be some things you like and some things you don't, but on the overall, it's still Dylan, right? It's kind of how we feel about Seinfeld, right? There's almost like three sort of eras of Seinfeld. There's the first era up to about season 5, when after season 5, Larry Charles leaves, Tom Sharonis, the director, leaves. And then you have 6 and 7. Without them, it's a little bit different. And then Larry leaves after 7. You got a whole different show in 8 and 9, where seasons 8 and 9, where it just gets a little bit kooky for our taste. We noticed, I know you don't remember probably, but some of your reviews in the book, there were like blurbs, but you could tell if you really liked an episode or did just by one line, you would kind of slip in. And we noticed you seem to lean more towards the earlier seasons for the most part, I think. But maybe if you remember any of that, like we're more of sort of the, seasons 2 through 5, 6 and 7 still good. We think 8 and 9 gets a little bit outlandish, a little more cartoonish, just not really our style. But, there's something for everyone, right?
Yeah, no, it's so funny. And I think I've discussed that over the years a little bit with some of the guys who I'm sure you've talked about a lot, but like, because when I did this book, the showrunners, I think it was Larry Charles who left. Yeah, you say, did he leave like 5 after the 5th season? Like, yep. He's a fascinating guy. And I did also, I think in this book, I wrote about Peter Melman trying to do the show It's Like which was that after Seinfeld ended?
Yes. He left. Well, he was doing it. Yeah, pretty much
towards the end. Yeah. And those guys, it's very, I do have the sense that, and any show, like, that's why Phil talked about like ending Raymond. It's like, you just have to get off before you tarnish your brand. And I don't think Seinfeld tarnished their brand, but I do think it hit its peak in that sort of early mid section was sort of gold. And then it just sort of, it wasn't like it was ever not great. It just was. And I don't know how much you've dealt with the finale over the years. Like, I always felt the interesting thing about the finale is that I feel exactly like what you were saying about the connection with the characters. And the finale had that sort of, to me, slightly flawed premise that these were like horrible people. Like, I think in a weird way, Larry like the genius of Curb was sort of wrongly pushed into that finale in advance, because it was sort of on the idea of like having fun with how horrible we all are. But I don't actually feel the horrible of the Seinfeld characters. I think they're perfectly human and exactly like, relatable and real. Like those characters were not like monsters to me. And yet, he wanted to, in that finale, do Crime and Punishment with them. And it's interesting and funny that he wanted to do that. But ultimately, I will say that's not the way I feel about the characters. I don't find them as compromised as, that would suggest.
I think we agree. I mean, especially George. I mean, George is as real as it gets, and we all can relate to George. I never saw him as horrible or nefarious. It was just, like you said, it's human nature how he was.
Yes, male. I think one of the interesting things about Seinfeld that I haven't, if I were to go back to it in like a cancellation Me Too consciousness, like I think it nailed how men are about women. I think like, finding fault in Jerry and the sort of the way they both had such complicated connections to women, up to and not that there's anything wrong with that. It's like, I don't know are there episodes that Seinfeld has pulled out of circulation because they would be canceled? I don't know. I'd be interesting to go back to it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a little, there is some controversy over the years with like the Cigar Store Indian, things like that. But we've had, we had Winona on the show, a Native American. She had no issues with it. She was funny as funny. So like she saw the beauty in the writing there. So when, our podcast is pretty much a dedication to the guest stars. Like we think the guest stars are kind of the foundation. The big four are critical, clearly, but I think the beauty of this show is the big four let guest stars shine, right? Whether it's Keith Hernandez or Bookman or Putty or Jackie Chow, all these guys like have built careers from Seinfeld. I'd love to hear from you. We'll get back to the main four, but from a guest star perspective, who are some of your favorites throughout the years?
Well, you mentioned Jackie, the lawyer. What's the name of the actor? He's the son of an actor I like too.
Phil Morris?
Yeah, he's great. I love that character. I love what's weird is in my life, I think like at like parent events at my kid's school, you run into some of these characters and you can't believe it. Like someone I knew was married to the rabbi. I forget his name.
You're literally running into them.
The actors, yes. Oh, no. Yeah, if you go to school where I went, I think actually Jason Alexander did almost every school fundraiser I ever had to go to of my kids when they were in elementary school because his kids went there, and it was like, as a parent, it was just a fascinating mix of like, it's like, oh my God, Jason Alexander, who's a great song and dance man, is doing the fundraiser. And then the fourth year of the fundraiser, you're like, okay, can we move on? Can we get Johnny Depp, who was a dad at school, host this year? Bob Odenkirk was a father at the school. He did a couple fundraisers. So yeah, I'm saying literally in my weird world, living in LA, ran into half these people all the time.
Wow. Yeah. You had mentioned earlier that, maybe now you're more inclined to kind of watch newer shows or kind of see what's on and do the streaming thing or something like that. Looking back, especially from the eye that you have, the critical eye, like what do you see in anything that's been on since Seinfeld that kind of, took a nod from Seinfeld or kind of, wouldn't maybe been, because Seinfeld was groundbreaking, right? We all can say that it pretty much was like nothing before it. You're right. So then after it, what kind of? I mean, a lot of people point to like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I think as sort of taking it to another level, or even Louis C.K. show, sort of about the stand up world and stuff. But anything you see in other shows or just in general, in your world where it's like, oh yeah, that might have been a Seinfeld kind of. I don't know, not premise and stuff, but just maybe a footprint or a thumbprint, I guess, as you would say.
I think, because I probably, because the sitcom is sort of not in its golden age again, but I do think It's Always Sunny is actually probably the best comparison. I watched that with my kids who were, who loved it. And I gradually realized, oh my God, this is a brilliant, brilliant show. And I think I feel the same way about that, because it does create that, hyper crazy family unit that is not family. It's like all the shows, like we talk with Friends, that obviously was a big phenomenon. Like people just project, people make their own family. And that's what I think. That's why I was sort of more offended by the idea of like Seinfeld, there's no touching, people act like there was no warmth. I actually thought it was like pretty loving family. It kind of reminded me of my family, the crazy, issues that people have. We have issues with our family. It's like even Newman, everyone has a member, a cousin or someone who walks in the house and it's like, God, but they're still kind of family. And so I do think, I think you're right about Always Sunny. I don't think I watch nearly as much like comedy. I'm trying to think what I watch. Like, it's interesting that Julia Louis-Dreyfus kept doing shows that I watched. Like Veep was a show, a comedy I loved. And even my wife and I loved The New Adventures of Old Christine. But in general, I don't think I get as much of my comedy from sitcoms. And I don't know if you're allowed to say, I did like Louis in the early years, and I love Better Things. We just had Pam Adlon.
Oh yeah, she was just on your show, right? Yeah, she's great.
And I love that show, but I will say that's an example of a show that dug deep and really, in a weird way, it's it sort of moved past what a sitcom can do and really, went to the whole human comedy. And I think ultimately, as I've gotten older, I'm not looking like, I think the years I was watching Seinfeld and Friends and Raymond were years when I had little kids and they went to bed around 8:00 and you could turn on a sitcom and escape and just laugh. I don't like, we're now like, as an hour and a half ago, we're empty nesters again. And so I like, last night, my wife and I were obsessively watching a British comedy about a family of divorce lawyers, drama, like really well. So I'm not looking for the same kind of laughs. And when I want to laugh, I'll go to, probably more often comedy. Go out and see. I go to a lot of comedy at Largo here in LA, which is really a great place for comedy.
Yeah, you mentioned Julia, and you mentioned Raymond. I believe Patricia Heaton tried out for that original Elaine role back in the day. You could quote me on that. But could you imagine, just the way they cast this, can you imagine Kramer not being Michael Richards, Julia not being Elaine? Have you ever seen a show cast so perfectly as this was?
Phil says that is the definition of a show you love. It couldn't be anyone else. Now, interestingly, we had recently Valerie Bertinelli came on our podcast, and it turned out she auditioned also to be Deborah on Raymond. And like, that was a case where I went, no, that wouldn't have been the same, but it wouldn't have been like that, that there could have been, knowing her, that could have been an interesting alternate universe. But with Seinfeld, you're right. Like, seeing Jerry Seinfeld, who was a brilliant comedian, but he did need to be surrounded by actors. And he got like such, and that happened with Raymond too. Like Ray Romano, one of the great comedians, also at the comic strip I saw in New York constantly right before I moved out here in 91. But I guess you could say, unlike Jerry, like Ray Romano has become one of the great dramatic actors around. Now, I don't think Jerry ever aspired to that. Jerry got great at being a sitcom actor. I don't think he was never going to do Shakespeare. Ray Romano literally could do Shakespeare. And it's interesting, you mentioned Michael Richards. I just had a flashback to, I did interview Michael for Rolling Stone once. And my memory, he I'm not saying he was Kramer, but there were certain Kramer qualities that were hysterical. Like after I wrote about him, he called me. He goes, David, I have a friend who's sick. Can you make me a list of 101 records he should have? Like, and I'm like, okay, I did it. But he did it with a certain Kramer-like intensity. But yeah, I think it's just interesting. I think you're 100% right when you say the Seinfeld cast was perfect. It couldn't be better. And I think that's true in Raymond. And often it's like the person you don't expect. Like in the case of Raymond, Brad Garrett, they were looking for a shorter guy to Ray Romano, and in walks the building known as Brad Garrett, and it turned out that was perfect. And in the same way, I think Michael Richards, coming from Fridays, he just brought like a crazy energy to the show. And it's weird. I don't know if you've dealt with him and all the crap all the stuff he went through and trouble he got in, but like, I would like to go back to Raymond. I'm sorry. I would like to go back and watch some Seinfelds to just remember how he is one of the only physical comedians. Physical comedy is not necessarily my favorite thing, but he was brilliant at it. Like he really was. And I assume it ages well, his sort of physicality.
Yeah, I think it does. I think you're right about that. And we've talked to a lot of guest stars, including someone who actually dated him for quite a while. And they all had great things to say about him, especially his craft and the way he perfected that going into the door thing. And he'd always be practicing it and all his pratfalls and everything, like you said, the physical comedy. So yeah, he gets praised all the time. So yeah, it is a shame what happened there. But hopefully, I know Jerry's thrown him a bone a few times. So but curious, you brought it up, so I'm just wondering what would be some of your what's your 10 albums to go to at the moment. I'm sure they change all the time. What are your where do you land in these days?
It changes every day.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Dylan. I'm a Dylan fanatic. So it's always going to be either. So if I'll pick 5, and I'll always going to be a Dylan record. And I am the Jewish guy who's obsessed with the Christian era of Bob Dylan. Love.
Oh, interesting.
One of my first concerts was seeing him on one of the early Christian tours. Love that stuff. So I'll take Slow Train Coming today, which is one of my favorite Dylan records, but it could be Street Legal or Blonde on Blonde tomorrow. I'll always take a Beatles record. I did during the pandemic, wrote 2 books with Ringo, one about the Beatles called Lifted. But I'll always take either Rubber Soul or Revolver, depending on the day. I just did the Grammys, and we just announced I'm doing interviewing Bonnie Raitt at the Grammy Museum March 5th. And so I'm going to take I guess I'll take Nick of Time, because that was sort of the breakthrough record of Bonnie Raitt, because I'm listening to her nonstop as I prepare for that. And then the other 2, what am I going to take today? Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life, is my Desert Island disc. He was amazing on the Grammys this year. I got to live out a couple more dreams with him. He was just on this Paul Simon Grammy tribute we did that aired end of last year. He's one of my heroes, and that's maybe my favorite album of all time. And then if I have one more, because I'm terrible at counting, I'll always go Brian Wilson, Pet Sounds. We just did a Grammy tribute to the Beach Boys after the Grammys, and it sort of got me back into Pet Sounds. So those are some.
Can't go wrong with that.
Very nice. So, most memorable Grammy line, we'll go back to Seinfeld in a sec, most memorable Grammy line you wrote or we would be aware of. Do you remember? For the last 20 years?
There's so many. I will say that, just a year ago, because when we're having this conversation, this week will be the year anniversary of the Ukraine invasion. I, in the most unique way, through a special app, communicated with the President Zelensky to write his Grammy. We collaborated. We co-wrote his Grammy sort of appearance last year, which was really powerful. And so working with him, working with the First Lady this year, working LL Cool J, who I loved as a host when Whitney Houston died the night before the show, writing a new monologue for him. And that's a famous one because it was a tough thing to come out, the day right after he died, right after Whitney died, and he had to deal with it. I could quote some lines, but I won't, because that would make me seem even more self-obsessed than I am. But it could be anything from those two. Listen, the last couple of years, Trevor Noah is a dream to work with, a great host. And then sometimes I do jokes that are kind of, Borscht Belt that, an example I just thought of the other day, because there was Ozzy Osbourne was in the news the other day. And there was a couple of years ago, not a couple of years, probably 8 years ago, he'd almost died in some sort of home accident, with a tractor on his front yard or something, like a garden or something crazy. And they said, but he still wanted to come out and present. And I gave him a line that I knew from old comedy my dad liked, which was, I think he walked out and just said, "It's good to be here. It's good to be anywhere," which is literally old Borscht Belt.
Right.
But to get to recycle old jokes, write new jokes for some of these great people. So I couldn't. I'd have to make a list of top 10. But I guess the thing I'm proudest of, I'm trying to think if anyone from Seinfeld was there. I was the head writer. The way I fell into TV from journalism really was, in addition to getting asked to write the Grammys, I was the head writer for the Tribute to Heroes telethon after 9/11. And the opening of that was Tom Hanks, and that opening speech, the call I had right before you was with a major mogul who asked me to help write a speech for him, but he asked for an example of my writing, and I'm like, I've been, I don't know what to do at this point to send it. I'm rarely asked. I don't have a resume anymore. It's it's a good thing about being old. You just, you sort of stand on your record. But this was a big shot, and he asked for, who I hadn't really worked with, and so I said, here, this is Tom Hanks' opening speech for the Tribute to Heroes. That's example of how I write. So
that's a great. So it reminds me of Jerry doing the pledge drives on the Seinfeld show.
Oh my God, yeah.
This is no joking matter. And if Danny Tartable was here, but anyway, So you mentioned you love baseball. I'm curious. Obviously, I know you interviewed Steinbrenner for your book. What were some of your favorite, or you were talking about that? How was it talking with George, and do you remember what his thoughts were about the show? I know he tried out for it back in the day, but he did such a brutal job that Larry just, he couldn't put him on, right?
Yeah. What's funny is I remember, those were all phone calls, and I was thrilled to have them. And I have a weird baseball. Are you both baseball fans?
Yeah.
I'm a baseball fanatic, but I have a weird relationship with it because I moved here in 91, and I remember I was a Mets fan. I wasn't a Mets fan who hated the Yankees, but I grew up my first memory just about is watching. Maybe I don't know if I watched the '69 Mets. I was too little, but I did watch the next couple of seasons when they were still pretty good.
Yeah.
And I loved that team. I love Tom Seaver, all of that. I liked the Yankees also, and always watched the Yankees, and Steinbrenner was a great character. But when I moved here, I remember telling my wife when we met, I'm going to abandon New York baseball because I'm marrying you, we're going to have kids, and I want my kids to have a home team that I can root with them for. So I became a Dodgers fan, and I'm justified it in my head because my dad had given me The Boys of Summer, the book about the Brooklyn Dodgers of his childhood. It was one of the first books I ever read. Roger Kahn, if you haven't read it, one of the greatest, maybe the greatest sports book I've ever read. But so I said, I'm justified in becoming a Dodgers fan because my dad was a Dodgers fan. And I have had the best baseball luck because I mentioned Brad Paisley, who wrote the theme song for our podcast and is a great friend. We were hanging out, working on shows and projects and writing monologues for many years during the end of the baseball season. And so I somehow helped get him hooked on the Dodgers. He became much even bigger Dodger fan than I was. And the great thing about that is there are a lot of country music fans in Major League Baseball, among them Clayton Kershaw, who sort of adopted Brad really, but took me along, so that like the last, I've got to live every baseball dream, including being on the field for the World Series during the national anthem, meeting Sandy Koufax, meeting Hank Aaron, all those dreams, getting in to sit in the front row of any game only because of Brad and Clayton and
Wow.
a woman named Sharon Hernandez, I love, who arranges that. But so I have lived out every baseball dream late in life. I'm sort of, and it's worked out well because my kids, when you become an empty nester, you have more time for baseball.
David, it's okay.
Kramer's fantasy camp.
Yeah.
Tony flip-flop from the Mets and Yankees is all good. Wait, so Brad Paisley, so chicken parm, you taste so good. Is that your theme song?
I'm sorry?
Brad Paisley, chicken parm, you taste so good. Did he do that with Peyton Manning?
Oh, that was his Manning thing.
I love our theme song. If you can squeeze it in the episode, I love it. It's like, and the truth is, we were doing a TV special for him on ABC, and he was so happy with how it came out and how hard I worked for him on it that he said, I owe you a favor. What is the favor? Anything you want. And I said, I want you to play my funeral. I want to make sure there's someone good playing my funeral. And he goes, booked. He goes, I can't wait. I'm so excited to play your funeral. And then when Phil and I decided to do this show, one day we were talking and I said, we should have a theme song, because if you're going to have a show, why not have a theme song? And so I called Brad and said, you're unbooked for my funeral. You don't have to play when I die. But you have to write us a theme song, which he did. And I love the song. But the funny thing is, as Phil says, now he has to play your funeral because he has to play your theme song. So we'll see.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Just talking about the Dodgers, I'm wondering, have you ever, I don't know if we talked about, do you ever cross paths with Larry at all, Larry David, and any of these, just the circles you're on? It looks like, sounds like you said with the school and also with Dodger games and things like that. I'm just curious, did you ever kind of run into Larry?
I'm totally a fanboy, so I'm nervous around him. The most notable time was I wrote the liner notes. Talk about a band. I'm sorry, we left out the Stones. Exile on Main.
Yeah, Exile's got to be up there.
I wrote the liner notes for the Stones. And Mick called me on a Thursday night. I didn't know him well. I'd interviewed him once. Goes, David Love, would you write liner notes for us by Friday? I'm like, what? Yes, okay. And it was for a collection of 2 CD greatest hits called 40 Licks, which was a really big collection. But when I wrote that, I had to negotiate my fee directly with Mick, who he's a good negotiator. So I negotiated the amount, but I said, okay, that's not so high. So I still demand a signed copy from you and Keith and 2 free tickets to any Stone show I want. And he goes, okay, just pick the show. And I picked the show, and Larry David, he gave us 3rd row seats. Larry David was 2nd row, and I'll never forget it because he looked uncomfortable, like as his character would be at a concert. Like he didn't seem to know how to, how you look like an idiot when you shake your head or dance. It's like he looked semi-awkward, but I remembered vividly because my wife, who was still like a young mom, fell asleep sat down and fell asleep during the show. And I remember nervously not wanting Larry David to stare at her looking, being asleep at a Stone show. But I think he might have gotten an episode out of it if he ever saw it.
Wow. Larry David at a Stone show. That's hilarious. That's great, man. Just hearing that, Mick Jagger calling you up to do liner notes, that's got to be a wild ride, huh?
I will say I'm a straight guy as far as I know, but when he said David Love, I was totally excited. It was, it's not bad. It was, I'm still, that's one of the interesting things. I'm a TV guy now, but still the rock critic in me is always thrilled when I get to write an essay for an artist. I wrote liner notes for Sinatra, which is why he's behind me for the duets record, 40 Licks for the Stones. And it's kind of when my dad was dying, I mentioned him in the liner notes of that. And in hospice years ago, he literally told the nurse, my son got me mentioned on a Sinatra record. And I'm like, okay, that's the kind of thing you can't, that actually paid well, but that paid me so much more because like the fact that I know I made my dad proud because he, at the end of his life, he was name dropping Frank Sinatra to nurses.
Wow. That's great, man.
Well, David, that's a good note to leave on, man. That's a great story. And like I said, can't thank you enough for taking a trip, telling all these stories. Best of luck on the podcast. You and Phil are great together. So read the book. Read the book again, 1998. Great read. Totally Unauthorized Tribute to Seinfeld.
I'm sure you can get it for, if it's available, we probably get it for, is it Amazon 99 cents or whatever? Or if you put a postage stamp on it. Oh, here's one last music thing. I pulled my copy out and I realized it's one of the books I used that's a Linda McCartney portrait of me. I was on the road with Paul and Linda, which is when they ordered me to marry my wife, but Linda took a picture of me and she goes, use this for your books. So this might be one of the only books that I use it on this showrunner's book. No. So
wow.
Yes, I did get to use my Linda McCartney portrait there.
That's great.
Awesome.
Check it
David,
out.
thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, David. This was great. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thanks, David.
Bye-bye.